The deadly encounter. The crimson moons of Arcton hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the barren wasteland. Jack's boots crunched against the jagged stones as he moved with practiced silence. His target was close. He could feel it. The tracker on his wrist blinked steadily, pulsing with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Dren Volus, the infamous smuggler, was hiding somewhere in this rocky graveyard, but something wasn't right. Jack froze, his instincts screaming at him. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled. He wasn't alone. A shadow shifted, too fast to be human. Before Jack could react, a blade sliced through the air, stopping just inches from his throat. He spun around, his blaster aimed at a tall, imposing figure cloaked in dark armor. Her piercing golden eyes locked onto his, and he immediately recognized her. Lyra of Philonis, the infamous alien warrior. She had a reputation almost as dangerous as his own. "Step aside, human," she growled, her voice low and threatening. "Volus is mine." Jack smirked, though his grip on the blaster tightened. "Funny, I don't recall your name on the bounty poster." Lyra's blade gleamed under the twin moons as she tilted her head, assessing him. "If you think I'll let some earthborn bounty hunter take what's mine, you're mistaken." Before Jack could respond, the sound of an explosion echoed in the distance. Both turned toward the source, a flash of light from the ruins ahead. It was Volus. He was making his escape. Jack didn't hesitate. He darted toward the ruins, ignoring Lyra's warning shout. A second later, she was at his heels, her blade gleaming as she kept pace. They were enemies, but for now, they had the same goal: catch Volus before he slipped away. The chase led them into an ancient temple carved into the mountainside, its entrance partially hidden by crumbling rocks. Jack's boots skidded on the dusty floor as he slowed, his blaster raised. The temple was dark, with faint blue lights flickering along the walls. Strange markings covered the surfaces, alien symbols Jack couldn't read. Lyra stepped in behind him, her blade drawn. "Careful, human. These ruins are cursed." Jack rolled his eyes. "Cursed, ha? Let me guess, you believe in ghost stories." Before she could answer, the ground beneath them trembled. A deep rumble echoed through the temple, and Jack's stomach sank. He looked up just in time to see the heavy stone doors slam shut behind them. "Great," he muttered, turning to glare at Lyra. "Now we're both trapped." Her eyes narrowed, but before she could retort, a sharp mechanical whirring sound filled the air. The walls began to shift, ancient machinery grinding to life. Panels slid open to reveal glowing orbs embedded in the walls, each one pulsing with a faint blue light. Lyra cursed in her native tongue. "This isn't a temple. It's a trap." Jack didn't need convincing. The glowing orbs suddenly shot beams of light across the room, creating a deadly web of lasers. One wrong move, and they'd be sliced to pieces. "Stay close," he ordered, carefully stepping through the shifting beams. Lyra hesitated for a moment before following, her movements graceful and precise. As they navigated the trap, Jack couldn't help but glance at her. There was something about the way she moved, so calculated and fearless, that almost impressed him. Almost. "Why are you really here?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "Volus is small time for someone like you." Lyra didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was colder than the air around them. "He stole something from my people. I intend to get it back." Jack raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Whatever her reason, it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was catching Volus and surviving this death trap. As they approached the end of the corridor, the lasers suddenly shut off. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of their breathing. Jack stepped forward cautiously, his blaster ready. They entered a massive chamber filled with strange machinery and glowing crystals. In the center stood Volus, a smug grin on his face. "You're too late," he taunted, holding up a small glowing device. "I've already activated it." Before Jack could react, the ground shook violently, and a section of the ceiling began to collapse. Volus bolted toward an exit on the far side of the room, disappearing into the shadows. Jack cursed, his instincts screaming at him to follow. But as debris rained down from above, he realized they had a bigger problem. "We have to move," he shouted at Lyra, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the nearest exit. She hesitated for a split second before nodding, and together they sprinted through the crumbling chamber. The part ends with the two of them barely escaping into a dark tunnel, the sound of collapsing rubble behind them. They're forced to face the fact that their survival now depends on working together, whether they like it or not. Trapped together. The silence was deafening. Dust hung thick in the air, illuminated by the faint glow of Jack's wrist light. He coughed, waving his hand to clear the haze, and glanced at the collapsed tunnel behind them. The way back was gone, buried under tons of rubble. "Great," Jack muttered, leaning against the cool stone wall. "Trapped in an ancient death trap with my favorite Velfar warrior." Lyra's golden eyes narrowed as she sheathed her blade. "You're lucky I didn't leave you behind, human." Jack smirked, though his irritation was clear. "Yeah, well, if we don't find another way out of here, neither of us is leaving." Lyra didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed on the glowing markings that lined the walls of the narrow corridor they now found themselves in. The symbols pulsed faintly, as though alive, casting strange shadows that seemed to dance and twist around them. "What's the deal with these markings?" Jack asked, breaking the uneasy silence. "They're warnings," Lyra said quietly. Her usually confident tone was laced with unease. "My ancestors believed this place was cursed. They spoke of an ancient weapon hidden deep within, powerful enough to tear entire galaxies apart." Jack raised an eyebrow, his skepticism obvious. "Cursed, huh? Sounds like something to scare off kids." Lyra shot him a sharp look. "Believe what you want, but these symbols are no myth. This place was meant to keep intruders out, or kill them if they didn't heed the warnings." Jack shrugged, brushing off her words. "Right. Well, curse or not, I'm not dying in here. Let's move." He pushed ahead, his wrist light cutting through the darkness. Lyra followed, her footsteps nearly silent despite the loose stones beneath their feet. As they walked, the tunnel began to slope downward, the air growing colder and heavier with each step. The uneasy silence between them didn't last long. "Why are you really after Volus?" Jack asked, glancing over his shoulder at her. "Don't tell me it's just for some family heirloom." Lyra hesitated, her jaw tightening. "He stole something that doesn't belong to him. That's all you need to know." Jack stopped, turning to face her. "Look, if we're going to survive this, we need to trust each other. Whatever he took, it's clearly worth risking your life for." Lyra's eyes burned with restrained anger. For a moment, Jack thought she wouldn't answer. Then, finally, she spoke. "He stole a key." "A key?" Jack frowned. "To what?" "To this." She gestured to the walls around them. "To the weapon. Without it, the weapon can't be activated. If Volus gets out of here with that key, he'll sell it to the highest bidder, and whoever buys it will have the power to destroy everything in their path." Jack let out a low whistle. "So this isn't just about your people, is it? This is about the entire galaxy." Lyra didn't respond, but the grim look on her face was answer enough. Before Jack could press her further, the tunnel opened into a massive chamber. The sight before them made him stop in his tracks. The walls were lined with towering pillars, each one carved with intricate symbols that seemed to hum with energy. In the center of the room was a massive, circular platform, its surface glowing faintly. "What is this place?" Jack whispered, stepping cautiously toward the platform. Lyra followed, her hand resting on the hilt of her blade. "It's the core, the heart of the weapon." As they approached the platform, a sudden noise shattered the stillness. A low growl echoed through the chamber, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against stone. Jack spun around, his blaster raised, as a pair of glowing eyes appeared in the darkness. "What the hell is that?" he hissed, backing toward the platform. Lyra's expression hardened. A guardian. The creature stepped into the light, revealing a massive wolf-like beast with shimmering black fur and teeth as sharp as daggers. It let out a deafening roar, its eyes locking onto the intruders. Jack's heart pounded as he glanced at Lyra. "Please tell me you've dealt with one of these before." "Once," she said, unsheathing her blade. It didn't end well. The beast lunged, and the chamber erupted into chaos. "The enemy of my enemy." The sound of labored breathing echoed through the tight passageway as Jack and Lyra pressed on, their bodies tense and weapons ready. The air was heavy, thick with the metallic tang of danger. Somewhere deeper in the temple, Dren Volus was making his next move, and they both knew it wasn't going to be good. "We're wasting time," Jack muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. His voice was sharp, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "If we don't catch up to him, he'll slip away, and this whole nightmare will be for nothing." Lyra didn't even glance at him, her golden eyes scanning the faintly glowing symbols etched into the walls. Her silence was grating, but Jack had learned enough to know when not to push her. Finally, she stopped. "This isn't just a chase anymore, human. Volus knows this place better than we do. He's leading us deeper into the trap." Jack frowned, his grip tightening on his blaster. "Then what do you suggest? Sitting here and waiting for him to come back and kill us?" "No." Lyra's voice was steady, her blade glinting in the dim light as she stepped closer to him. "I suggest we stop thinking like prey and start thinking like hunters." Before Jack could respond, a faint clicking sound echoed through the corridor. It was rhythmic and precise, growing louder with every passing second. Jack's blood ran cold. "What the hell is that?" Lyra's expression darkened. "Scavenger drones. Volus must have activated them." The clicking turned into a whirring buzz as a swarm of small, spider-like machines emerged from the shadows, their metallic legs glinting ominously. Their glowing red eyes scanned the corridor, locking onto Jack and Lyra. "Run," Lyra said, her voice low but firm. Jack didn't need to be told twice. They bolted down the corridor, the drones skittering after them with terrifying speed. The air filled with the sound of mechanical legs scraping against stone, and Jack's pulse pounded in his ears. "Any bright ideas, Velthar?" Jack shouted as he fired blindly over his shoulder, the blasts ricocheting off the walls. "Keep running." Lyra snapped, her blade slicing through a drone that lunged at her. Sparks flew as the machine crumpled to the ground, but more took its place. The corridor opened into a vast chamber, and Jack skidded to a halt, nearly losing his balance. The room was filled with ancient machinery, its purpose long forgotten. Massive gears turned slowly in the background, and a glowing crystal hummed with energy in the center of the room. "This way," Lyra called, pulling Jack toward a narrow alcove. They dove inside just as the swarm of drones flooded the chamber, their red eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. Jack leaned against the wall, catching his breath. "Tell me you have a plan." Lyra didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the glowing crystal in the center of the room. "That's the power core," she said finally. "If we can overload it, we might be able to destroy the drones and slow Volus down." Jack stared at her. "You want to blow this place up? Are you insane?" Lyra's gaze snapped to his, her expression fierce. "Do you have a better idea? Because if we don't stop those drones, we'll never make it out of here alive." Jack hesitated, his mind racing. He hated to admit it, but she was right. As much as he hated relying on her, they were in this together now. "Fine," he said, his voice grudging. "But if this kills us, I'm blaming you." Lyra smirked, a hint of amusement breaking through her usually stoic demeanor. "You'll be dead, human. You won't have the chance." They crept back into the chamber, keeping to the shadows as the drone swarmed around the machinery. Lyra moved with a predator's grace, her blade ready, while Jack's blaster hummed softly in his hand. "Cover me," Lyra whispered, her eyes never leaving the glowing crystal. "I'll overload the core. You keep them off me." Jack nodded, his jaw tight. "Try not to die." As Lyra sprinted toward the core, Jack stepped out of the shadows, firing at the nearest drones. The chamber erupted into chaos as the drones turned their attention to him, their sharp legs clattering against the stone floor. Lyra reached the core, her hands moving quickly as she manipulated the ancient controls. The crystal's glow began to intensify, casting an eerie light over the room. "Hurry up," Jack shouted, blasting another drone out of the air. "I'm working on it," Lyra snapped, her fingers flying across the controls. The crystal's hum grew louder, and the air crackled with energy. Just as the drones closed in on Jack, a deafening explosion rocked the chamber. The power core erupted in a blinding flash of light, sending shockwaves through the room. The drones froze mid-movement before collapsing to the ground, their circuits fried. Jack shielded his eyes, coughing as dust filled the air. When the light faded, he turned to see Lyra standing by the shattered core, her blade still in hand. She looked tired but triumphant. "Not bad," Jack admitted grudgingly as he approached her. Lyra smirked. "I told you, human, I don't lose." Before Jack could respond, a low rumble echoed through the chamber. The explosion had destabilized the structure, and the ceiling began to crack. "We're not done yet," Lyra said, grabbing his arm. "Move." They sprinted toward an exit as the chamber began to collapse, the ground shaking beneath their feet. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, whether they liked it or not. The unlikely bond. The soft glow of an emergency flare cast dancing shadows against the jagged walls of the cavern. Jack sat slumped against a boulder, wincing as he pressed a makeshift bandage against the gash on his leg. Blood seeped through the fabric, and the pain was sharp, but he couldn't let it slow him down. Across from him, Lyra paced in silence. Her golden eyes scanned the darkness as she held her blade at her side, its surface still glinting with faint sparks from their last fight. The collapse of the chamber had forced them into this narrow cavern, far from Volus's trail. Jack broke the tense silence. "You know, for someone who's supposed to be a great warrior, you didn't exactly have a backup plan for that explosion." Lyra stopped pacing, turning her sharp gaze toward him. "And for someone who never stops talking, you didn't exactly dodge that falling debris, did you?" Jack let out a bitter chuckle. "Touché." Lyra knelt down a few feet away, examining the faintly glowing symbols etched into the cavern floor. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a weight to her silence that Jack couldn't ignore. "Something bothering you?" he asked, his tone lighter but still laced with curiosity. She didn't look up. "These markings, they're older than I thought. This place isn't just a ruin. It's a sanctuary. My people built it to protect the weapon from anyone unworthy of wielding it." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Define unworthy." "Because I'm starting to think Volus doesn't qualify." Lyra's jaw tightened. "That's the problem. He shouldn't have been able to activate anything, let alone get this far. Either he's smarter than we gave him credit for, or someone gave him help." Jack's stomach sank at the implication. "You think there's someone else involved?" "Possibly," Lyra said, standing up. She turned to him, her expression unusually soft. "But that's a problem for later. You're injured, and we need you alive if we're going to finish this." Jack waved her off. "I've had worse. Besides, you've got enough brute strength for the both of us." Lyra rolled her eyes but didn't argue. Instead, she surprised him by kneeling beside him, pulling out a small vial from her utility belt. She poured its contents onto his bandage, and Jack hissed as the liquid sizzled against his wound. "Relax," she said, her tone flat. "It's a healing agent, not acid." Jack shot her a glare but stayed still as the stinging subsided, replaced by a cooling sensation. "Didn't take you for the nurturing type." "I'm not," Lyra replied, standing up and returning the vial to her belt. "But if you die, I'll have to do this alone. And I'd rather not." For the first time since they'd met, Jack thought he saw a flicker of humor in her expression. It was gone as quickly as it came, but it was enough to make him smirk. "Don't get too sentimental on me, Velthar," he teased. "We've got a reputation to maintain." Lyra shook her head, but there was no denying the faint curve of her lips. "Let's just focus on staying alive." The brief moment of levity was cut short by a distant sound, a low, rhythmic pounding that seemed to grow louder with each passing second. Lyra's body tensed, and Jack instinctively reached for his blaster. "What now?" he muttered, struggling to his feet. Lyra's gaze was fixed on the tunnel ahead, her blade already drawn. "Whatever it is, it's big." The pounding grew louder, shaking the ground beneath them. Rocks began to fall from the ceiling, and Jack felt his heart race. Then, from the darkness, a hulking silhouette emerged. It was a massive insect-like creature, its chitinous body gleaming in the faint light. Its 6 glowing eyes locked onto them, and it let out a bone-rattling screech. Jack stared in disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me." Lyra didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, her blade slicing through the air as the creature charged. Jack raised his blaster, firing at the beast's legs, but the creature's armored shell deflected the shots. "Go for the joints," Lyra shouted, dodging a swipe of the creature's massive claw. "The armor's too thick everywhere else." Jack gritted his teeth and adjusted his aim, targeting the creature's leg joints. His blaster shots found their mark, and the creature let out a pained screech, staggering slightly. Lyra took the opportunity to leap onto its back, her blade plunging deep into the soft tissue between its armored plates. The creature thrashed wildly, slamming into the walls of the cavern as she held on. Jack fired another shot, this time hitting the creature's glowing eyes. It let out a final deafening screech before collapsing to the ground, its body twitching before going still. The cavern fell silent, save for the sound of Jack's ragged breathing. Lyra slid off the creature's back, her blade dripping with its black ichor. "Not bad," she said, her tone almost approving. Jack leaned against the wall, shaking his head. "Remind me to never follow you into a temple again." Lyra smirked. "If we survive this, I'll consider it a favor." As the two of them caught their breath, the faint glow of the symbols on the walls began to intensify. A new path had opened up in the chaos, leading deeper into the temple. Without a word, Lyra stepped forward, her determination unshaken. Jack followed, his blaster at the ready. Whatever awaited them, they would face it together, enemies no longer, but reluctant allies bound by survival. A race against time. The walls seemed alive, pulsing with a strange rhythmic glow that cast eerie shadows across the ancient chamber. Jack's heart pounded as he stared at the device in the center of the room. A sphere of swirling energy encased in alien machinery. It hovered above the ground, humming with a sound that seemed to vibrate deep in his bones. "That's it," Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her golden eyes were locked on the device, her usually steady demeanor shaken. "The core of the weapon. If Volus activates it." "He already has," Jack interrupted, pointing to the faint red light blinking on the console next to the sphere. "Look." Lyra's expression hardened as she stepped forward, her blade drawn. "We don't have much time." The two moved cautiously toward the device, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Jack's blaster was ready, but his attention kept shifting to the sphere. The energy inside it seemed to twist and churn, and he could swear it was getting brighter. "What's the plan?" Jack asked, glancing at Lyra. "Please tell me you have one." Lyra didn't answer right away. Instead, she studied the alien console, her fingers brushing over the glowing symbols etched into its surface. "This is Velthar tech. I might be able to shut it down." "Might." Jack raised an eyebrow. "That's not exactly reassuring." Before Lyra could respond, a loud metallic clank echoed through the chamber. Both of them turned as a massive door on the far side slid open, revealing Volus. He stood there with a smug grin, flanked by two hulking robotic guards, their weapons humming with lethal energy. "Well, well," Volus said, stepping into the room. "You two just don't know when to quit, do you?" Jack raised his blaster, aiming it at Volus. "Turn it off, Volus. Whatever you think you're doing, it's not going to end well for you." Volus chuckled, spreading his arms wide. "End well? Oh, I think it's going to end beautifully. Do you have any idea what this weapon can do? Entire fleets reduced to ash. Planets wiped clean in an instant, and all of it under my control." "You're a lunatic," Lyra spat, her blade gleaming as she stepped closer. "This weapon wasn't meant to be used. It was meant to be sealed away forever." "Ah, but that's the problem with you, Velfar," Volus sneered. "Always so afraid of power. Well, not me. I'm going to sell this baby to the highest bidder, and there's nothing you can do to stop me." Volus nodded to his guards, and they stepped forward, raising their weapons. Jack fired first, taking out one of the robots with a well-aimed shot. Lyra moved like a blur, her blade slicing through the second guard in a single fluid motion. Volus backed away, panic flashing across his face. "You're making a mistake." "No," Lyra said coldly, her blade pointed at him. "You are." Before she could strike, the console behind her let out a shrill alarm. The sphere's glow intensified, and the entire chamber began to shake. "What did you do?" Jack shouted over the noise. Lyra's eyes widened as she turned back to the console. "It's destabilizing. The energy is building too fast. If it reaches critical, it'll wipe out everything within 100 light years." Volus seized the distraction, grabbing a small device from his belt and activating the hidden door. "Good luck, heroes," he called, disappearing through the opening. "Damn it," Jack cursed, starting to follow, but Lyra grabbed his arm. "We don't have time," she said, pulling him toward the console. "We have to stop this now." Jack looked at the swirling energy, his stomach twisting. "And how exactly do we do that without blowing ourselves up?" Lyra's expression was grim. "We overload it. Force it to collapse in on itself before the energy stabilizes." Jack stared at her, horrified. "That sounds an awful lot like blowing ourselves up." "It's the only way," Lyra insisted, "unless you have a better idea." Jack gritted his teeth, his mind racing. He didn't trust her plan. But what choice did they have? "Fine," he said finally. "What do you need me to do?" Lyra pointed to a set of glowing panels on the console. "I'll handle the core. You need to disable the fail-safe systems so it can overload. But you'll have to be fast. Once we start, there's no going back." Jack nodded, swallowing hard. "Got it." They worked quickly, their movements frantic as the chamber continued to quake. Sparks flew from the console as Jack ripped open a panel, his hands flying over the exposed wires. Lyra's fingers danced across the controls, her expression focused but tense. "Almost there," she muttered, her voice barely audible over the rising hum of the sphere. Jack glanced at her, his heart pounding. "Lyra, if this doesn't work—" "It will," she interrupted, her eyes meeting his. "It has to." Before he could respond, the sphere let out a deafening roar, and a blinding light filled the chamber. The ground beneath them shook violently, and Jack felt himself being thrown backward as the energy erupted. The screen fades to white, leaving the outcome uncertain. Sacrifices made. The blinding light faded, replaced by a suffocating silence. Jack opened his eyes, blinking against the swirling haze of dust and smoke. His ears rang, and every muscle in his body screamed in protest as he forced himself to sit up. The chamber was unrecognizable. Cracked walls, scorched floors, and the faint glow of the destabilized core still pulsing in the center like a dying heartbeat. "Lyra," Jack's voice was hoarse as he scanned the rubble. Panic clawed at his chest when he didn't see her. "Lyra, where are you?" A weak groan answered him. He turned, his heart lurching as he spotted her pinned beneath a large chunk of debris. Her blade lay just out of reach, and her golden eyes flickered weakly as she tried to move. "Don't," she rasped, her voice strained. "The core, it's still active." Jack ignored her, scrambling to her side. His hands trembled as he tried to lift the debris, but it wouldn't budge. "Stay still. I'll get you out of here." Lyra's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist with surprising strength. "Listen to me," she said, her voice laced with urgency. "The core didn't fully collapse. If we don't shut it down completely, it's going to go critical." Jack's jaw tightened. "Then we'll shut it down together." "You don't understand," Lyra said, coughing as blood trickled from the corner of her mouth. "It's too unstable. One of us has to stay here to finish the job, and there's no time for both of us to escape." Jack froze, her words sinking in like ice. "No, absolutely not." Her grip on his wrist tightened. "This is bigger than us, Jack. If that core goes off, it'll take out half the galaxy." "I don't care," Jack snapped, his voice breaking. "I'm not leaving you here to die." Lyra's gaze softened, and for the first time since they'd met, the fire in her eyes dimmed. "Jack, you're the only one who can make it out. You have to warn the galaxy about this weapon, about what people like Volus will do if they find another." Jack shook his head, his throat tightening. "Don't do this. We can find another way." "There is no other way," Lyra said firmly. Her hand slipped from his wrist, and she pressed something cold into his palm. He looked down to see a small glowing crystal, a memory shard. "What's this?" he asked, his voice trembling. "It's everything I know about the weapon," she said. "Take it. Use it to stop anyone else from making the same mistake my people did." Jack stared at the shard, his mind racing. He didn't want to take it. He didn't want to leave her. But the resolve in her eyes told him there was no arguing with her. The core let out a low, ominous hum, and the ground beneath them trembled violently. Time was running out. "Go," Lyra whispered. "Now." Jack clenched his jaw, his heart shattering as he rose to his feet. He looked at her one last time, memorizing every detail of her face, the warrior who had gone from enemy to ally, and now, the one making the ultimate sacrifice. "I'll come back for you," he said, his voice breaking. Lyra gave him a faint smile. "I'll hold you to that." With a heavy heart, Jack turned and ran, the shard clutched tightly in his hand. The tunnel leading out of the chamber was collapsing around him, but he didn't look back. He couldn't. The sound of the core growing louder spurred him on, every step driving him further from the woman he'd grown to care about, and closer to the unknown. As he reached the surface, the ground shook violently, and a blinding light erupted from the entrance behind him. He was thrown to the ground as the shockwave rippled across the barren landscape. When he looked up, the temple was gone, replaced by a smoking crater. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Jack's knees buckled, and he fell to the ground, his chest heaving as he tried to process what had just happened. The shard in his hand pulsed faintly, a reminder of the promise he'd made. He whispered her name under his breath, a vow etched into his soul. Lyra. But there was no time to grieve. Somewhere out there, Dren Volus was still alive, and the galaxy's greatest threat hadn't been eliminated. Jack wiped the dust from his face, his resolve hardening. He'd make sure Lyra's sacrifice wasn't in vain. The race wasn't over yet. From feud to fiery passion. The stars above Arcton's barren surface were unusually bright, their cold light mocking Jack's storm of emotions. He sat at the edge of the smoldering crater, the memory shard clutched tightly in his hand. The heat from the destroyed temple still radiated from the ground, but it was nothing compared to the burning ache in his chest. She was gone. Lyra, the Velfar warrior who had fought by his side, the one who had risked everything to stop the weapon, had sacrificed herself to save the galaxy, and he'd left her behind. Jack stared at the shard, its faint glow pulsing in rhythm with his racing heartbeat. It held her knowledge, her warnings, her legacy, but it wasn't her. It would never be her. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. I should have stayed. The silence that followed was unbearable. The vast emptiness of the moon seemed to stretch endlessly, and for the first time, Jack felt truly alone. He had always prided himself on being a survivor, a lone wolf who didn't need anyone. But now, that solitude felt like a curse. As he stood, his mind racing with anger and grief, a faint sound caught his attention. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a whisper carried on the wind. Jack. He froze, his breath hitching. It couldn't be. He turned toward the crater, his pulse quickening. The glow from the depths of the rubble shifted, flickering like a heartbeat. No way, he muttered, scrambling down the unstable edge. The heat was intense, but Jack didn't care. He climbed over the wreckage, ignoring the sharp edges cutting into his hands. The light grew brighter as he neared the center, and his heart leaped when he saw her. Lyra, lying amidst the rubble, her armor cracked and her skin streaked with ash. Her chest rose and fell faintly, her breaths shallow but steady. The glow wasn't coming from her, but from the shard embedded in her gauntlet. Somehow, it had absorbed the core's energy, shielding her from the blast. Lyra. Jack dropped to his knees beside her, his hands trembling as he touched her shoulder. You're alive. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she looked at him as though he were a dream. Then her lips curved into a weak smirk. You came back. Of course I did, Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. You really think I'd let you get all the glory? Lyra let out a soft laugh, but it quickly turned into a wince. The core. It's gone, Jack assured her. You did it. The weapons destroyed. Her eyes softened, relief washing over her features. Good. Jack helped her sit up, careful not to jostle her too much. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke of survival, of understanding, of everything they had been through together. You're an idiot, Lyra said finally, her voice teasing but tired. You should have left me. Jack shook his head. Yeah, well, I guess I'm not as good at following orders as you thought. She smiled faintly, her fingers brushing against his hand. Thank you. Their eyes met, and for the first time, the barriers between them dissolved completely. The animosity, the rivalry, the walls they had built to protect themselves. It all fell away. In its place was something raw and undeniable. Jack leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra, I thought I lost you. You didn't, she replied, her hand resting on his cheek. And I'm not going anywhere. The distance between them disappeared, and their lips met in a kiss that was both fiery and tender. It wasn't just a kiss of passion. It was a promise, a bond forged through fire and survival. In that moment, they weren't human and Velthar. They were just two souls who had found each other in the chaos of the galaxy. When they finally pulled apart, Lyra smirked. So, does this mean we're allies now? Jack laughed, his heart lighter than it had been in days. I guess it does. They helped each other out of the crater, leaning on one another as they made their way back to Jack's ship. The journey wasn't over. Volus was still out there, and the galaxy was still full of dangers. But for the first time, Jack didn't feel like he was facing it alone. As the ship's engines roared to life, Jack glanced at Lyra, who was seated beside him, her eyes scanning the stars. He reached over and took her hand, squeezing it gently. Ready? He asked. Lyra turned to him, her golden eyes glowing with determination. Always. The ship shot into the stars, leaving behind the ruins of the past and carrying them toward a future they would face together. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Jack knew one thing for certain: they were stronger together. And this was only the beginning.